The Committee on Science, Space, and Technology will come to order. Welcome to today's hearing entitled The Administration's Climate Plan, Failure by Design. I'm going to recognize myself for an opening statement, then the ranking member. Today we look at one of the most aggressive new government programs in our country's history. The Obama administration calls it the Climate Action Plan. It empowers the Departments of Interior, Energy, Agriculture, Defense, Transportation, Housing and Urban Development, Health and Human Services, National Institute of Standards and Technologies, NOAA, FEMA, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the EPA to implement broad climate policies and programs with great cost and little benefit to the American people. The cornerstone of the White House Sweeping Climate Action Plan is EPA's power plant regulation. Extending well beyond the power plants themselves, this rule will increase the cost of electricity and the cost of doing business. It will make it harder for the American people to make ends meet. In fact, EPA's own data shows us that its power plant regulation would eliminate less than 1% of global carbon emissions. Analysis shows that this would reduce sea level rise by the thickness of a mere 3 sheets of paper at best. EPA's mandates will be difficult for states to meet even under ideal circumstances. If energy prices or energy demands escalate, the cost of meeting those mandates will soar and American families will be forced to pay the bill. Charles McConnell, a former Assistant Secretary for Energy appointed by President Obama, has taken the administration to task for creating a plan doomed to fail. In a recent op-ed, Mr. McConnell asked, "Have we lost our minds? Has this administration convinced itself that it can mandate something that is fundamentally useless? Does the EPA think the American public and global community are not capable of seeing the illusion for what it is?" What's clear is that by eliminating affordable, reliable power options, the regulations will increase the energy prices for the majority of Americans. That means everything will cost more, from electricity to gasoline to food. Higher costs will drive companies out of business, kill good jobs, and leave even more Americans unemployed. Until this administration can propose a detailed strategy, tell us the total cost, and show us exactly what we will get for the sacrifice, we are just asking the American people to waste their money. America cannot afford to drive its economy over a cliff with the hopes that the rest of the world will make the same mistake. The only economy the EPA's plan will help is that of our competitors. That concludes my opening statement, and the ranking member, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, is recognized for hers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to all. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our witnesses, Dr. Holdren and Ms. McCabe, and thank both of you for being here this morning. It is nice to see you again, and I appreciate you taking time to appear before us today. This morning we're going to discuss the President's Climate Action Plan, and a part of that plan, a proposal by the Environmental Protection Agency to cut carbon emissions from the largest source of those emissions, power plants. I'd like to begin by noting the title given to this morning's hearing by my Republican colleagues, the Administration's Climate Plan, Failure by Design. Failure by design is an ironic choice of words, considering my colleagues' preferred alternative appears to be doing nothing and hiding our collective heads in the sand. We all know that such an action will not solve anything, and it certainly won't stop the earth from warming. And in my opinion, the majority's do-nothing plan is a real example of failure by design. I also know that some still question whether climate change is real, but surely we are now beyond debating that question. Reports based on the work of the world's top scientists, such as the U.S. National Climate Assessment and those from the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, have sent a stark message to our nation's leaders and the international community. Namely, the adverse effects on climate change are evident today and require immediate action. Of those adverse effects will go dramatically worse. To be fair, in trying to understand a phenomenon of this magnitude, the job of science will never be done. It will continue to evolve. We must always keep looking for new answers, replacing opinions with data and projections with observations. We must continue to innovate in how we predict, measure, prevent, and adapt to climate change. That is the nature of science and of our stewardship to this planet. However, we in Congress have to acknowledge that we are not the experts and that allowing partisan politics to distort scientific understanding of climate change is cynical and short-sighted. We may not agree on where the uncertainties within climate science lie, but we should all be able to understand that vast and avoidable uncertainties will remain if we stop the progress of climate research. Experts from industry, academia, and every level of government are calling on us to help prepare our communities for the threats they face due to climate change. We must answer that call and act. Cutting carbon emissions from the power sector is critical to any effort to address climate change, and that is why I'm supportive of EPA's Clean Power Plan. EPA's proposal, like the rest of the President's Climate Action Plan, is a bold step forward that our nation needs. It gives the states the flexibility to develop innovative policies that cater to regional differences. It is based on strategies already in use, such as improving energy efficiency and encouraging the development of renewables. Let us be clear. EPA is not imposing a specific set of measures. States will choose what goes into their plans, and they can work alone or as part of a multi-state effort to achieve meaningful reductions. These are common sense steps that would lead to a healthier environment, because acting on climate change is not only an environmental imperative, but a public health and economic one as well. Among the many health concerns, greater risk of asthma attacks, heat strokes, respiratory disease are all consequences of warming climate. Likewise, energy demand, agriculture production, labor productivity, and the risk of coastal properties are just a few of the economic areas where climate change has already taken and will continue to take its toll. We as a nation must act today to address climate change if we are to preserve our quality of life for our children and grandchildren. The negative consequences of climate change are not abstract scientific predictions for the far-off future. We are facing some of these consequences now, and they are affecting every American. I look forward to working with this administration as it puts forward policies like the Clean Power Plan and the Climate Action Plan, which will ensure a vibrant future economy and a safe and healthy environment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before I yield back, I want to share that there is an article from thinkprogress.org that I'd like to submit to the record. While some in Congress still refuse to admit that climate change is even happening, there is evidence here that where this article describes how 8 major food companies have accepted the reality of climate change and are prepared to address the threats posed to their products and financial interests. Chipotle, Curing Green Mountain, Michael Foods, Big Heart Pet Brands, Omega Protein, Marine Harvest ASA, and most notably Heinz and Coca-Cola. To quote the beverage tycoon, changing weather patterns along with the increased frequency or duration of extreme weather conditions could impact the availability or increase the cost of key raw materials that the company uses to produce its products. In addition, the sale of these products can be impacted by weather conditions. I ask unanimous consent that this article be included in the record.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. And without objection, those materials will be a part of the record, though I think you've just succeeded in reading almost all of it into the record already.
That's okay.
We'll get a double dip on that. I'll now proceed to introduce our witnesses, and we do appreciate their being here today. Our first witness is the Honorable John Holdren. Dr. Holdren serves as the Director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House, where he is both the Assistant to the President for Science and Technology and co-chair of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, called PCAST. Prior to his current appointment by President Obama, Dr. Holdren was a professor in both the Kennedy School of Government and the Department of Earth Science at Harvard. Before that, he was a member of the faculty at the University of California, Berkeley, where he found and led a graduate degree program in energy and resources. Dr. Holdren graduated from MIT with degrees in aerospace engineering and theoretical plasma physics. Our second witness is Ms. Janet McCabe, Acting Assistant Administrator for the Office of Air and Radiation at the Environmental Protection Agency. Previously, she was the Office of Air and Radiation's Principal Deputy to the Assistant Administrator. Prior to joining EPA, Ms. McCabe was the Executive Director of Improving Kids Environment, Inc., a children's environmental health advocacy organization. She also previously served in several leadership positions in the Indiana Department of Environmental Management's Office of Air Quality. Ms. McCabe received both her undergraduate degree and law degree from Harvard. Again, we thank you for being here today, and Dr. Holdren will begin with you.
Thank you very much, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Johnson, members of the committee. I am genuinely pleased to be here today to discuss the ways that the federal government has incorporated and continues to incorporate scientific information from the most authoritative sources into the formulation and implementation of all three components of President Obama's Climate Action Plan: cutting carbon pollution in America, preparing the United States for the impacts of climate change, and leading international efforts to address the global climate change challenge. Given the thrust of my testimony and noting Ranking Member Johnson's comments on the title of the hearing, I'd like to propose respectfully an alternative one: the administration's climate plan, Success Through Science. That plan rests primarily on scientific and technological understandings in three categories. First, the natural science of anthropogenic climate change and its impacts on human well-being. Second, technological analysis of the options for climate change mitigation and for increasing preparedness for and resilience against the changes in climate that mitigation fails to avoid. And third, the economics associated with estimating both the costs of action and the costs of inaction on the climate change challenge. There is an immense amount of peer-reviewed research in all three categories, and assessments summarizing the state of knowledge in all three have been carried out by a wide variety of respected national and international bodies. Examples include the reviews by the U.S. National Academies and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the second and third U.S. National Climate Assessments, the annual State of the Climate reports of NOAA, the periodic assessment reports of the U.S. Global Change Research Program, and the first quadrennial energy technology review of the U.S. Department of Energy. These assessments and many more were drawn upon in the interagency effort led by the Executive Office of the President, which developed the elements of the Climate Action Plan for the President's consideration. A particularly accessible digest of the relevant state of knowledge as of early 2013 and a set of recommendations based on that knowledge was provided to the President and the interagency group in March of that year by the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. That report's influence on the Climate Action Plan was considerable. My written statement discusses in some detail those conclusions from the indicated scientific assessments that were and are most germane to the formulation of the Climate Action Plan and to its implementation. Given President Obama's commitment from the beginning of his administration to the rigorous use of the best available scientific and technical information in formulating policy, it should not be surprising that the scientific conclusions summarized in my written statement are reflected across all elements of the Climate Action Plan and continue to underpin its implementation. Specifically, an up-to-date understanding of the natural science of anthropogenic climate change and its impacts on human well-being provides, first, the motivation for seeking to develop a cost-effective plan to reduce those impacts. Second, the sense of urgency for doing so at once rather than waiting. Third, the understanding that such a plan must include not only measures to reduce the emissions that are driving global climate change, but also measures to increase preparedness for and resilience against the climate changes that can no longer be avoided. Fourth, the detailed knowledge of the sources of the offending emissions and the character of society's vulnerabilities that allows appropriate specificity in designing a plan. And fifth, the recognition that any U.S. plan must include a component designed to bring other countries along. These are the most basic underpinnings of the Climate Action Plan. Further, an up-to-date understanding of technological possibilities for both mitigation and preparedness and resilience reveals that there indeed exists a wide range of options for cutting the carbon pollution that is driving climate change and for better preparing society to deal with the changes that materialize. The available technical insights about these options have enabled the Climate Action Plan to focus specifically on enabling and incentivizing progress on the implementation and, where necessary, the further development of the most promising options. Finally, an up-to-date understanding of the results of economic assessments of the cost of taking actions of these kinds versus the cost of inaction provides the confidence that moving ahead now is the right thing to do, and more specifically, has provided the basis for the Climate Action Plan's focus on those options that are most clearly cost-effective and that bring significant co-benefits. Because the Climate Action Plan focuses only on the low-hanging fruit that is within reach without action by Congress, the cost of implementing it will be relatively low and indeed might well be completely repaid by the co-benefits. Of course, there's still more that could and should be done beyond the Climate Action Plan that would require the support of the Congress. I hope that that support will be forthcoming. I thank the committee for its interest in this critically important issue, and I'll be pleased to take any questions the members may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Holdren. Ms. McCabe.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, and good morning, and Ranking Member Johnson and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm very pleased to be here with Dr. Holdren. The science is clear, the risks are clear, and the high costs of climate inaction are clear. We must act. That's why President Obama laid out a climate action plan and why on June 2nd of this year, Administrator McCarthy signed the proposed Clean Power Plan to cut carbon pollution, build a more resilient nation, and lead the world in our global climate fight. Power plants are the largest source of carbon dioxide emissions in the United States. And while the United States has limits in place for the level of arsenic, mercury, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and particle pollution that power plants can emit, there are currently
There we go. Well, we're getting there. Yeah. There we go. Ms. McCabe, if you'll proceed, I hope that this is fixed permanently. Thank you.
America know how it works. As I was saying, while the United States currently has standards in place for a range of harmful pollutants that are emitted by power plants, there are currently no national limits on carbon pollution from these sources. The power plan aims to cut energy waste and leverage cleaner energy sources by doing two things. First, it uses a national framework to set achievable state-specific goals to cut carbon pollution per megawatt hour of electricity generated. Second, it empowers the states to chart their own customized path to meeting their goals. We know that coal and natural gas play a significant role in a diverse national energy mix. This plan does not change that. It builds on actions already underway to modernize aging plants, increase efficiency, and lower pollution, and it paves a more certain path for conventional fuels in a clean energy economy. The EPA's stakeholder outreach and public engagement in preparation for this rulemaking was and continues to be unprecedented. Starting last summer, we held 11 public listening sessions around the country. We participated in hundreds of meetings with a broad range of stakeholders across the country and talked with every state. Now, the second phase of our public engagement is underway. We've already held 4 public hearings in Atlanta, Denver, Pittsburgh, and Washington, D.C., at which over 1,300 people testified. We've had hundreds of calls and meetings with states and other stakeholders, and we have already received more than 750,000 comments. Through meetings, phone calls, and other outreach, we are proactively seeking input, and many states, utilities, and other stakeholders are bringing us suggestions that reflect the significant and thoughtful work they are putting into responding to this proposal. Because of this strong interest, in fact, we announced yesterday that we are extending the comment period for an additional 45 days to December 1st. These are just the sort of discussions we need to have, and these are not mere words. This is a proposal. We want and need input from the public. To craft the proposed state goals, we looked at where states are today and we followed where they are going. Each state is different, so each goal and each path can be different. The goals spring from smart and sensible opportunities that states and businesses are taking advantage of right now. Under the proposal, the states have a flexible compliance path that allows them to design plans sensitive to their needs, including considering jobs and communities in a transitioning energy world. It allows them enough time, 15 years from when the rule is final until compliance with the final target, to consider and make the right investments, ensure reliability, and avoid stranded assets. All told, in 2030, when states meet their goals, our proposal will result in about 30% less carbon pollution from the power sector across the United States when compared to 2005 levels. In addition, we will cut pollution that causes smog and soot by more than 25%. Together, these reductions will provide important health benefits to our most vulnerable citizens, including our children. In 2030, the Clean Power Plan will deliver climate and health benefits of up to $90 billion. And because energy efficiency is a cost-effective strategy, we predict that in 2030, average electricity bills for American families will be 8% cheaper. This proposal has started an active conversation about the steps that states, cities, utilities, and others are already taking to reduce carbon pollution, and about how the EPA can set targets and a reasonable schedule that can be achieved by every state using measures they choose themselves to suit their own needs. The EPA looks forward to discussion of the proposal over the next several months, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McCabe. The gentleman from Indiana, the chairman of the Research and Technology Subcommittee, has a markup in another committee and has to leave immediately, so I'm going to recognize him for questions, and then I'll take his place when it's time for him to ask questions. Mr. Buchan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Over the last few years, we've gone from global warming to now climate change, since the temperature of the Earth hasn't changed in many, many years. The temperature of the Earth has been changing for centuries. I fully believe that the temperature of the Earth is changing. But of course now supporters of this new regulation are saying, well, it's changing now at an unusual pace compared to the past, because now that the American public is getting it that the temperature of the Earth has been changing for centuries. Ms. McCabe, first of all, welcome from Indiana. This plan places a heavy burden on the states. Many state legislatures will need to approve enabling statutes to implement the rule. For example, we have heard from previous witnesses that have come before this committee that states will need to devise institutional arrangements between State Public Utility Commission and state environmental regulators to implement carbon-driven resource planning. Further, states will need to consider legislation to implement energy efficiency measures to meet the goals under the plan, and to grant additional authorities to state public utility commissions on such matters as stranded investment and cost allocation. It's quite possible that certain states, for whatever reason, will be unable to make these steps, in which case the state plans will be inadequate under the proposal, thus mandating the EPA issue Federal Implementation Plan, or FIPs. Can you describe for me what an FIP would look like where a state has failed to enact the necessary laws to carry out EPA's plan for them? For example, what would EPA-imposed energy efficiency mandate look like, and how would EPA allocate costs under such a mandate?
Congressman, thank you for your question. Let me first emphasize that in the plan, the proposal, we certainly recognize that there are steps that states will need to take in order to put authorities in place and design their plans. And we provided several years for that work to take place, assuming that states will be going forward with that. Many states already have programs in place that they will be able to use or build upon. And we're confident that working with the states, as EPA always has in implementing Clean Air Act programs, that we will be able to find time and work with each other to make sure that states have the time they need to put authorities in place. And that is what we are focused on at the moment, is making sure that we understand one another, that we hear from the states about the timing challenges that they expect to have and the things that they need to do. And we're confident that we will be able to move forward with states in a productive way so that they can be successful in developing and implementing their own plans.
Thank you. Is it true that this rule has no effect on the global temperature change?
This rule is about cutting carbon pollution, and cutting carbon pollution will help address the contributions to the effects that we're seeing about.
Because we've heard previous administrators from the EPA say that it won't. It's not about affecting the global temperature and climate change.
Well, I can differ.
Can I take that?
Sure.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that if I may.
Yeah, I mean, there's public comments out there that question has been asked and answered saying no.
You should look at the scientific literature rather than the public comments. The fact
of all
is,
the climatologists whose career depends on the climate changing to keep themselves publishing articles, yes, I could read that, but I don't believe it.
If you would allow me to finish, the point is that the limitation on carbon emissions in the United States is a very important first step for us to take on a longer trajectory to meet the President's goals of a 17% reduction from 2005 by 2020 and ultimately an 80+% reduction by 2050. If the United States does not take that sort of action, it is unlikely that other major emitters in the world, China, India, Russia, Europe, Japan, will do so either. And the fact is all of us need to reduce our carbon emissions if we are to avoid unmanageable degrees of climate change.
Okay, fair enough. Ms. McCabe, there's some, there's some comments out there saying, asthma attacks decrease, heart attacks decrease. Where do you get that information? Because I was a medical doctor before, and it says in the first year the plan will avoid 100,000 asthma attacks and 2,100 heart attacks. I can tell you as a medical doctor, you cannot say that.
Well,
that's just scare tactics. That's not factual.
Well, all of our information is based on factual information that's developed and in the record and available for people to.
And let me just say, I reviewed that from the American Lung Association. In fact, their medical director came down last year from New York and spoke to me about this. And it's based on, is it true that it's, or not, that it's based on actually modeling and not actually factual patient data?
There is a large body of evidence that
is it based on computer modeling or is it based on factual medical data? That's the question, yes or no.
EPA uses both modeling and research.
And is it true that the model that was created to do this, the EPA paid tens of thousands of dollars to the person to create the model to, in my view, after I've looked at all the science, including people who funded the research, the funders of this research that was done are all pretty far left global warming foundations and others that want this data to come out. I mean, I'm just saying, it all depends. If you're a medical person and you look at who funds a study and the result of the study, I mean, I look at the first who funded it, and if people that believe the result funded it. You see where I'm getting at?
Yeah,
and it's all based on modeling, not based on factual information. So I just want to say,
can I take a piece of this as well?
Well, I'm over my time, so what I'll just say this, and I'll yield back to the chairman, that scare tactics like that, is really appalling to me, to use medical information to scare parents that their children about asthma attacks and scare people saying they're going to have heart attacks, and you're going to prevent that with this rule in the first year. That's just not factual. And I would argue that we should all, on both sides of this discussion, avoid scare tactics. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Buchan. The gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to both of our witnesses for appearing before us again to discuss this very important topic. And I'm glad that my colleague, Mr. Bouchon, mentioned scare tactics because, Mr. Chairman, I have an article that I'd like to submit for the record because we're likely to hear some arguments that the coal industry has used over the years to sway people against regulation designed to protect the environment. And so I'd like to introduce this article, which chronicles the coal industry's overreactions and some exaggerated claims over the last 40 years.
Okay, without objection, the article.
Thank you. I hope the committee members read this article as well. Thank you. Again, I'm going to begin my question in this hearing much the same way as I began when we held a similar hearing just over a month ago by briefly discussing the economic costs of failing to act to combat climate change. For communities, for example, in my district in Oregon, the threat of climate change brings serious economic consequences. The coastal communities with the fishing and seafood industries, for example, rely on a healthy ocean to support their livelihood. The agriculture sectors need freedom from concerns about drought. Changes in our climate brought on by record high carbon emissions causes economic concern. Many Fortune 500 companies are now building the economic realities of climate change into their long-term business plans. Insurance companies are starting to account for the increased frequency of severe weather events. These things are happening, and it's up to us as policymakers to act now to mitigate the damage. So, Dr. Holdren, first of all, thank you for your very thorough testimony. I do encourage members of the committee to read your entire written testimony, which is very thorough and detailed. We're here today to ostensibly discuss the science behind the EPA regulations. And because some people question whether the EPA is considering the economic impact of its regulations, can you please expand on the potential economic benefits of reducing greenhouse gas emissions through rules like the recently proposed rule limiting emissions from existing power plants?
Thank you. Happy to do that. There is some considerable discussion of that in my rather lengthy written statement. But the fact is that we are facing, under unabated continuation of global climate change, large increases in damages from a wide variety of extreme weather events, including in some regions floods, in other regions droughts, in many regions more extreme heat waves, in many regions more wildfires, pest outbreaks, pathogen spread in terms of geographic range. We're looking at impacts on many sectors of the economy, on the energy sector, the forestry sector, the agriculture sector, the fishery sector. We're looking at increases in ocean acidification that have the potential to dramatically change ocean food chains and fisheries possibilities. And we are looking, as already mentioned, at human health effects. And I would mention, although Dr. Bouchon has now left, that the models that are used in this domain are all based on data. They're based on patient data. They're based on epidemiological studies. And there is a wide range of models, not a single model. They have been funded by a wide range of sources. And the findings in the National Climate Assessment, which came out in May on the impacts of climate change on health, were thoroughly vetted by experts at the National Institutes of Health.
Thank you, Doctor. I do want to have time for one more quick question, but thank you for that clarification. On a related note, I want to follow up on something that was discussed in our July hearing. Dr. Cash from the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection stated that EPA's latest action will, quote, help the nation develop an advanced energy infrastructure. So can you please both comment briefly on the importance of having the United States lead the way in the development and implementation of the next generation of energy policies, and talk about whether the existence of rules will foster innovation by creating demand for new technologies?
I'll take a start at it. This is another example of how regulations will spur innovation and development of new technologies. In particular, what we found when we looked at what the power sector and states were already doing to address carbon is that they were investing in renewable energy and moving that forward. They were investing in energy efficiency and moving that forward. And there's huge opportunities, in addition to other sorts of technologies, for this plan to spur even greater investment in those sorts of technologies and move them into all across the country and into the mainstream.
And I trust you would both agree with me that we'd prefer that the United States be the leader in developing these technologies.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would just add and emphasize that countries all around the world are buying renewable energy technologies, they're buying energy efficiency technologies, they're buying cleaner fossil fuel technologies. They're going to be buying a lot more of them because it is recognized all around the world that climate change is real and we need to do something about it. And we will be far better off if the United States is the principal provider of those technologies in the decades ahead than if we allow other countries to take the lead in that domain.
Thank you. And my time has expired. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. The gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, is recognized for his question.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being with us today. Let me just note that about the last point. Yeah, we do have countries like Spain investing in other types of technology for producing energy, and it is breaking their bank. It is putting them into bankruptcy. We have, there's just a list of things that just note that this is a matter of contention that I would think the public should look at, whether or not there actually has been 17 years where there's been no warming, although that was what was predicted. We have, I keep seeing reports saying that there are no more hurricanes than there always have been, or they're not more extreme than they ever were. We have climate models, obviously, that have been presented that said we were going to have a huge jump in our temperature that were clearly wrong. The Arctic ice volume now is increasing rather than decreasing, as is the population of the polar bears increasing rather than decreasing. And we've seen an increase in plant growth and crop yields. So those are just matters of back and forth. Those people who believe that humankind and our activities are changing the climate, and those of us who don't, we need to know whether those specific issues, what the facts show on those things, because I keep hearing disagreement from those who would like to pass regulations like the ones we're talking about today. Ms. McCabe, at what point, you keep using the word carbon pollution, at what point a level of CO2 does CO2 become damaging to human health?
Well, carbon...
right now we have CO2 at about 400 parts per million. At what point does that actually become harmful to human beings?
I will let Dr. Holdren amplify my answer, but it is clear that the amount of carbon that is being emitted into the atmosphere now...
I'm asking for a specific number. You guys are the experts. You are here telling us to pass what we consider to be a draconian regulation. You should know at what point it becomes harmful to human health. If it's now at 400 parts per million, Dr. Holdren, maybe you have the answer to that. At what level does it become harmful to human beings?
Vice Chairman Rohrabacher, I always enjoy my interactions with you. I have to say with respect, that's a red herring. We are not interested in carbon dioxide concentrations because of their direct effect on human health. We're interested in them because their effect on the world's climate. And climate change has effects on human health.
Okay, so it's a red herring to say that when people are talking about human health, that there's no direct impact on human health, that this is something...
Not of CO2 concentrations. There is a direct, very strong indirect impact, and there's a strong direct effect, and there's a strong direct effect of co-emitted pollutants, like oxides of sulfur.
So let's go for the record that you have now agreed there is no direct impact on human health by CO2.
And a huge indirect impact.
And at what time, I guess we will say you're not even going to go, because the next level I was going to go to is how long will it take us to get to the point where it does actually impact on human health? And I'll just put in for the record that it seems that it's at 400 parts per million now, and between 1,000 and 2,000 parts is what we pump into greenhouses, and it's commonly accepted that it takes about 20,000 parts per million as differentiated from the 400 parts per million now that we have before it becomes harmful to human health, unless, of course, you want to say that those things that I just outlined are real, that there has actually been warming, that the models have been successful, that the Arctic ice now is not growing now, and that the population of the polar bears is continuing to diminish, and et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah.
May I respond?
You certainly may.
First of all, there is a long section in my testimony explaining that the so-called hiatus in global warming is not what you have portrayed it to be. It is a slowdown in the rate of increase of the atmospheric surface temperature from what occurred in previous decades. The fact is, even by that index, the Earth is still warming. The 2000s were warmer than the 90s. The 2010s so far have been warmer than the 2000s. 13 of the 14 hottest years in the instrumental record, going back 150 years, have occurred since 2000. And it is also true that in terms of the Arctic ice, in volume and in area at any given time of year, it continues to be on a shrinking trajectory, although, of course, there is natural variability that bounces it up and down a bit. But the trend is unmistakable.
But you will acknowledge that there are many scientists. By the way, I want to congratulate both of you, because the last time you were both here independently, when we tried to pin down this fraud of 97% of all the scientists agree that man-made global warming is now upon us, you both refused to back up that fraudulent claim, and I applaud you for that. But let me just note that when we're talking about these issues, the very issues that we brought up, there are legitimate scientists. This isn't just a claim here at the hearing. There are legitimate scientists on both of these issues, on both sides of the various issues that you and I just brought up. And I think that it behooves us not to just suggest that, well, this is what the fact is. I think that what we should all do is compare the various scientific facts that are coming in and not just dismiss all of the scientists who are claiming that no, the polar bears are not disappearing, and no, there are not more hurricanes, there are not more tornadoes, there are not more, critical weather situations going on. I think those issues need to be looked at with an open mind, and that both sides can look at it scientifically. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. The gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Kelly, is recognized for her questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mrs. McCabe, as you likely are aware, critics of this and virtually any other EPA proposed rule often claim that the economy and the American consumer will suffer as a result of efforts to make our environment cleaner and safer. More the sky is falling attitude towards actions that will protect the health of Americans is contradicted by the fact that the U.S. economy has tripled in size since the adoption of the Clean Air Act in 1970, which you know. One of the concerns often raised is that the Clean Power Plan will cause residential electricity prices to increase dramatically. Can you comment on that? Is that the case? And can you please describe the estimated impact that the proposed rule will have on Americans' electricity bills?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question.
Coming from Illinois, it's very important.
Yes, for me too. Yes, this is an issue that we look at in our regulatory impact assessment, which was put out with the proposed rule. We did take a look at the anticipated impacts on electricity bills. And because of the strong emphasis that we expect from states in looking at energy efficiency as a very clear and obvious and cost-effective approach, our analysis predicts that electricity bills for American families will go down by 2030 by about 8%. And that's a good thing for all of us, because you get the improved environment, you get the pollution reductions of other pollutants that come along with the carbon that will have immediate impacts on people in their neighborhoods and improve their health, and you also, through the increased use of energy efficiency, will get lower electric bills.
Where do you feel that your doubters or critics are getting their information from?
I don't know that I can speak to that, Congresswoman. People do the analyses that they choose to do. What we appreciate is the transparent and public process that we have during this proposal, so that people can bring whatever analysis they have to us, and everybody can take a look at that, and we can work through it.
Okay. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Kelly, and I'll recognize myself for questions next. And Dr. Holdren, let me direct my first question to you. The EPA says that its regulations will reduce carbon dioxide emissions by about 555 million tons per year in 2030. That same year, Department of Energy is projecting that China alone will emit about 14 billion tons of carbon dioxide every year. That means that after this costly and, in my view, burdensome rule is implemented, it will offset only 13 days of Chinese carbon dioxide emissions, and of course much less of the total world's emissions. And my question, and I want to focus on the impact of the rule. We'll get to the impact on other countries in a second, but wouldn't you agree that the impact of the rule, when and if implemented, would have a negligible impact on climate change?
As I've already said, this rule is a start. The Climate Action Plan is a start. If we do not make a start, we will never get to the kinds of reductions that we need. By the way, we will never get there without the Congress's help,
right.
Which is one of the reasons I'm so happy to be
What
here.
impact would this rule have on global temperatures, for example?
A small impact if we neglect the leadership role that the United States plays in the world. I've just been traveling around the world talking to leaders of other countries.
I'm going to get to the leadership question.
And they are appreciative of what we're doing.
Dr. Holden, let me finish. I'm going to get to the leadership question in a minute, but I want to get to the impact of this rule on climate change. You'd said it have a very small impact on global temperatures. What about its impact on the rise in sea levels?
That impact will also be small. And again, it is necessary to start or we will be hooked and flooded.
I just want to make sure that everybody understands the impact of the rule on climate change is going to be small, I would say negligible, given on what I've said. And as far as our leadership role goes, to me that's totally hypothetical and speculative. You've got China today building on the average, I think, of one new coal-fed power plant every week. And I don't think these other countries are going to have much of an incentive to follow anybody's lead if it's going to cost them more money and damage their economy. But I'm glad to have your answers on the small impact on climate change.
Can I answer the other point about our leadership? And about China and about India?
I think you already have today a couple of times, but I'd like to go to Ms. McCabe, and then if we have time, come back to that. The question, as I say it, to me, the impact on other countries is hypothetical. Ms. McCabe, let me ask you some of these same questions, but on the way there, you said a minute ago that the rule is about cutting carbon pollution. The EPA administrator, your boss, said when she testified before the Senate that this is not about pollution control. Why the contradiction in your statement and the administrator's statement?
Well, I'm not familiar with exactly what statement you're referring to. She may have been talking about the fact that there are technologies that would not be considered the traditional pollution control types of technologies that are available to reduce carbon.
On the surface, it looks like they're contradictory statements, but we'll look for another explanation. But let me go back and ask you some of the same questions I just asked Dr. Holden. What impact will this rule have on global temperatures? Is it going to be small? Is it going to be great? Is it going to be what?
Well, I certainly would defer to Dr. Holdren on the science questions. I would agree with him that the impacts of any single action will be small, but it takes many small actions to make a difference on this global problem.
And the impact would be small on global temperatures, and the impact would be small on any sea level rise as well, would it not?
Again, it takes many, many actions
I know,
to
but
make
the answer
the
to my
difference.
question is that it would be a small impact, and you would agree with Dr. Holdren.
I would agree.
Okay, thank you both very much. You've answered my questions, and we'll now go to the gentleman from California, Mr. Swalwell, for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, I just want to start with Dr. Holdren. Dr. Holdren, we heard a little bit about scare tactics earlier, but I wasn't around in 1970 when the Clean Air Act was passed. I came on the scene about 10 years later. But when the Clean Air Act was passed, everything I've read was that there were a number of scare tactics from industry around what it would do to our economy. Do you remember that?
I do.
And
I do.
And one of the scare tactics was that we would see our economy, rather than move forward, that the economy would move backwards. Do you remember that?
I do.
And isn't it true that, in fact, our economy has tripled in size since the Clean Air Act was passed in 1970?
I think that's roughly right. I'd have to double-check the figure.
And isn't it true that pollutants have been reduced by 70% since the Clean Air Act was passed in 1970?
At least many of the important ones have.
Okay. Did you read the New York Times story over the weekend on Germany's solar and wind investments?
I did.
Do you believe that the United States is any less capable than Germany in making investments in solar and wind? And what would it mean for reducing carbon emissions if we made investments that would have us have 30% of our energy supplied by renewables, as Germany is on track to do by the end of the year?
We are not technically less capable. We may be politically less capable of taking the necessary decisions.
And what would it do for our climate action plan if, over the next 15 years, we achieved what Germany is going to achieve by the end of this year, which is having 30% of its energy provided by renewables?
It would obviously be a great help.
Okay. And Ms. McCabe, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I would just confirm that we think increased use of renewable energy is going to be a key portion of states' plans that they can choose to develop. So I'd agree.
Also, Dr. Holdren, many have mentioned that even if we do something, that other countries, some of the bigger countries, China and India, if they do nothing, that our efforts could be negligible. However, don't we have some recourse to enforce or require other countries to take action? For example, can't nations that are being responsible, that are not being responsible in addressing this global threat, be slapped with a WTO complaint tariff?
Let me say that at this point I don't...
Sorry, a WTO compliant tariff?
I think at this point we don't need to talk about recourse, because the fact is that both China and India, the second and third biggest emitters in the world, are both taking far more action than most Americans realize. The Chinese, in their 12th five-year plan, put a target for reducing the percentage, a target for increasing the percentage of non-fossil fuel in primary energy consumption. We, by the way, have not done that. We don't have a non-carbon or low-carbon energy standard. China has set specific national targets for the expansion of nuclear, wind, solar, and natural gas. They have a carbon intensity target, which they are on track to meet. They have minimum energy efficiency standards across a wide range of appliances and vehicles.
And Dr.
they've been shutting down their old coal-burning power plants.
I appreciate you bringing that up,
more efficient ones.
I want to put into the record, if it's okay with the chair, two stories that back up what Dr. Holdren is saying. One, a September 12, 2014 story, China aims high for carbon market by 2020, and also a May 7, 2014 story, India goes green, drafts policy to lower carbon emissions.
Without objection, those two articles we made part of the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think the question that we are tasked with today is do something or do nothing. And as far as I'm concerned, plan always beats no plan, especially when the stakes are so high. And so I guess I would challenge my colleagues on the other side, if they want to do nothing, why don't we go ahead and build a do-nothing climate wall? We can put it somewhere out on the Washington Mall, and we can put all the names of the people who think that we should do nothing. And then in 100 years, we can let our children and grandchildren go to that wall and see who wanted to do nothing and who wanted to do something. And I hope we did something, and we will let history be the judge of what happens next.
Would the gentleman
and I yield back the balance of my time.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
The gentleman has yielded back. Thank you, Mr. Swalwell, and we'll now go to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, folks, for joining us today. Ms. McCabe, I'd like to start out. You acknowledged, in agreement with Dr. Holdren, that the rule would have a small impact in the climate spectrum. Do you also view the thousands of jobs and the economic impacts of these rules on the American people as small impacts?
Congressman, we take very seriously any expected impacts on the economy.
Well, the experts are saying, Ms. McCabe, I represent a district in Ohio that has 6 coal-fired power plants. I've got roughly 15,000 or so coal industry-related jobs. if these rules go forward, those jobs are going to be forfeited. So my question to you is, do you view those as small impacts?
I think that any job concerns to a community are significant and need to be paid attention to. This rule
are they acceptable to you?
This rule is being written in the context of a transitioning energy system.
Let's talk about that for a second. Transitioning energy position. You know, during this past winter, the polar vortex, the cold snap, many coal-fired power plants that are slated to retire were running at over 90% capacity. In Ohio, I've heard the experts say that we were one coal-fired power plant away from rolling brownouts and blackouts. And I'm already getting manufacturers today that are being asked to idle their manufacturing plants because there's not enough energy on the grid. So how would the grid have performed this past winter? And how high would have wholesale prices risen if the coal-based load power plant scheduled to close over the next 2 years, if they were not available this past winter? What has your analysis revealed about that? You take all that power off the grid, how would that have affected the price for energy and this past winter?
The Clean Power Plan envisions that in 2030, 30%.
I'm not talking about 2030. I'm talking about last winter. How would it have affected the wholesale prices if that energy had not, that you're planning to take off of the grid, if it had not been available? How would it have affected wholesale power, prices?
EPA is not planning to take any power off the grid. This plan would allow states to develop plans, and we see that energy reliability would not be compromised under the plan as we've devised it.
Oh, okay. Well, the states have a different view of that, I think. Let me ask you this then, talking about the states. Explain to me then how you intend to approve or disapprove of a state plan if a state submits a plan that has a different baseline than those that are set out in the proposed rule. Because the EPA's generation mix for 2012 doesn't include all the utilities that usually operate. For example, they were shut down that year or they did not operate. Mm-hmm. Will the EPA disapprove a state plan that sets a different reduction target than what the agency requires in the proposed rule because it failed to include a utility that did not operate in 2012?
This is why our rulemaking has a public process with opportunities for people to give us information. We want to make sure that the targets that we ultimately finalize are accurate and correct and based on correct information. And mm-hmm. we're in those discussions with states every day now to make sure that we have that right information.
Okay. Dr. Holmgren, you talked about success through science in your opening statement this morning. Last July, Steve McConnell, the former Assistant Secretary for Energy until last year, now at Rice University, testified before this committee that the relationship between the DOE and the EPA was really disingenuous interagency collaboration and simply a box-checking exercise. Further, he said it was an awkward dance because very often the inconvenient truths of technical evaluations didn't fit the political agenda, and that made it very difficult to actually have any collaboration, and in fact, as time went on, the communication became almost zero. Mr. McConnell gave an insightful example of where EPA's idea of checking the box on a 650-page technical document to the Department of Energy at 3 p.m. on a Friday afternoon, and EPA told them they had to respond back by 10 a.m. on Monday. So you're in charge of scientific and technical cooperation between departments and agencies. Is this how the Obama administration makes technical decisions that will cost the American taxpayers billions of dollars? Is this what you call success through science? Or is it simply a political agenda to shut down coal-fired power plants across the country?
It is certainly not a political agenda to shut down coal-fired power plants, and as you know, as I believe you know, under the Climate Action Plan, coal would still be providing 30% of U.S. electricity at the end of the period in 2030. But in terms of interagency cooperation, of course we want and we encourage interagency cooperation. I am responsible for the oversight of activities and initiatives that involve the cooperation of multiple agencies. We work hard at getting that to happen. I think it is happening. I think both EPA and DOE currently have not only very capable but very collaborative leaders in Secretary Moniz and Administrator McCarthy. I've seen them working closely together. I've seen the process of collaboration.
Right,
I'm not sure what happened when Mr. McConnell...
My time has almost expired, so let me ask Ms. McCabe then.
Your time has expired, more than expired. Thank you. And
I yield back.
Now, Ms. Edwards.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And Dr. Holden, and to both of our witnesses, thank you very much for being here. I think that we could not be dealing with any more important issue than this discussion right here, and we need to get off the dime on the politics because we're losing ground every single day. And I would like to ask the chairman, I have an article from the Washington Post that just appeared a couple of days ago that highlights the potential impact of flooding from storm surge that would threaten D.C., the District of Columbia infrastructure. And I would note it's a shame that Mr. Swalwell is no longer here and he's left, because I would tell him that if he were going to build that wall on the mall, he should choose a different place because it will be underwater. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter this article from the Washington Post appearing September 16th into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Dr. Holdren, as we just indicated, you know that our coastal communities are a major contributor to the U.S. economy that supports maritime commerce and shipping ports, fishing, tourism. I know Maryland has a great benefit to our economy because of our coast and our Chesapeake Bay. And all of these areas are highly vulnerable to the threat of sea level rise. In addition, in the Maryland Chesapeake Bay, the 5 states that comprise the watershed, that there's a lot of farmland there too. And so in addition to the economy that takes place on the water, there is the economy just bordering the water that really threatens us. The third National Climate Assessment asserts that more than $1 trillion of coastal property and infrastructure is at risk of inundation from a sea level rise of 2 feet above the current level. Can you outline the potential impact a 2-foot rise in sea level would have on the American economy?
Well, let me say a couple of things about that. One is that is quite extensively analyzed in the National Climate Assessment that came out in May. Second point is that the first phase of the Climate Data Initiative, which is part of the President's Climate Action Plan, and the first phase of the Climate Resilience Toolkit, which will be rolled out shortly, are both focused on providing more detailed data on the consequences of sea level rise of various levels on infrastructure and on the economy. And so while we already have rough accounts of how devastating sea level rise in that magnitude would be, we will soon have better ones, and we will have tools that will enable people on the coast all around the country to understand, anticipate, prepare for, and plan for the amounts of sea level rise that are likely to occur in their areas.
Dr. Holden, just to follow that up, I recall that just a couple of months ago there was another article, I think it was either in the New York Times or Washington Post, that talked about particular impacts in the Virginia Beach and Norfolk area to our military facilities. And in fact, as part of our military readiness and planning, they've tried to accommodate for that kind of rise. We've put billions of dollars into structuring and restructuring, rebuilding our ports to accommodate our military bases and facilities, because our Department of Defense actually does believe that there is a tremendous impact of climate change and contributing to sea level rise. Has there been an assessment of the threat to our defense, our national defense and military readiness?
There have been a number of reports by the Pentagon and by consultants to the Pentagon on the impacts of climate change on national security, and I would refer you to those. You are absolutely right, Congresswoman Edwards, that the Pentagon recognizes very clearly that climate change is a big challenge for our military and for our national security.
Thank you very much. And just to be clear, though, when we are thinking about the impact of the economy on our coastal communities, do we have a rough is there a rough estimate of how much of the population just on the two coasts, the Atlantic and the Pacific, that is attributed to that would be impacted by sea level rises?
I'm just in the process of looking up the number. I'm just in the process of looking up the number in the National Climate Assessment. There is an estimate in there of what fraction of the U.S. population lives at various heights above current sea level. I don't recall it off the top of my head.
Let's just say it's a boatload of people.
I'd be happy to get back to you with a quantitative answer on that.
Great. Thank you very much for your testimony.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bridenston.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When the president was campaigning in 2008, he was interviewing with the San Francisco Chronicle, and they asked him, quite infamously, they asked him, are you going to shut down coal-fired power plants? And his response was, well, no, I'm not going to shut them down. I'll just we'll increase regulations to the point where it's so expensive they won't be able to stay in business. I'd like to ask each of you, do you agree with the president's philosophy on that?
Well, first of all, I'm sure the president no longer agrees with it. Whatever he said in 2008, he's...
So that's not the president's philosophy?
It is not the president's philosophy.
Okay,
the president is not
so
trying to shut down the coal industry.
Yes or no, you don't agree with it?
I don't agree with the statement as you just presented it that the president apparently said in 2008, and he doesn't either.
Absolutely. We don't agree.
Okay, so has he recanted that or retracted it or apologized for suggesting that?
The National Climate Plan makes very clear, the Climate Action Plan makes very clear that we do not intend to shut down coal-fired power plants, and it is the president's plan. So I say he's absolutely clear on the record on that, and he has said it in a number of recent speeches as well.
Okay. Chuck McConnell is the executive director of the Energy and Environment Initiative at my alma mater, Rice University. He's a former assistant secretary of energy in this administration, and he testified before this committee about the environmental impacts of the administration's carbon plan that you've just mentioned, or rather the lack of the impact of the environmental plan. He says that the reductions in emissions resulting from these rules will account for less than 1/100th of 1 degree Celsius drop in temperatures. Do you guys agree with that?
I don't agree with it for the reasons I've already stated. Namely, we are beginning a process that is going to lead to further reductions. This rule alone.
For this rule, do you agree with that statement? 1/100th of 1 degree Celsius.
I would have to review the number before.
These are your models.
Before I subscribe.
These aren't my models. These are your models. Now he also suggested.
I'll be happy to review the number and get back to you. But the point is, this is a start.
I'm asking the questions here. He also suggested that it would increase sea levels by 1/3 of the width of a dime over 30 years. Do you agree with that assessment?
Again, I'll get back to you on the specific numbers, but the assessment is irrelevant. We are starting a process which is going to require larger emissions reductions going forward.
By China?
And if
we need larger...
Oh, absolutely we do, and China is already on that pathway as well. In some respects, they're ahead of us.
I'm glad to hear that China is on board with our plan. Because they weren't on board with our plan when we wanted to protect international waters in the South China Sea, were they?
We're not talking about the South China Sea.
No, we are, because the South
change.
China Sea is their next move, and they're doing it for energy purposes. But guess what? They didn't consult the Philippines. They didn't consult Vietnam. They didn't consult Malaysia or Indonesia. They didn't consult Taiwan. They just went ahead and said, we now control the South China Sea. Now, was that in the plan?
I am not defending what China has done in the South China Sea.
Well,
what I'm saying is China finds it in its own interest to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Does China do what is in our interest, or do they do what is in their interest? Because what we have seen is they do what is their interest, and they encourage us to do what is against our own interest. Do you agree with that?
No, I do not. In the case of climate change, it is in both our countries' interest to reduce both of our greenhouse gas emissions.
Then why are they continuing
and that is why we are cooperating in that domain.
You recognize that they are continuing to increase their emissions, and the more we reduce ours, we hinder our economy while their economy is growing more rapidly. Is that correct?
they are continuing to increase their emissions, but at a declining rate, and they are aiming to peak and then decline. Currently, we expect that China will be announcing an intention to peak by 2030, and we hope
they're going to peak in 2030.
And we hope that they will move that forward as the technological capabilities to do it become available.
I've got 30 seconds left. The mayor of Tulsa was here today, Dewey Bartlett. He's a good friend of mine. He would like me to ask you guys if you're aware that 50% of the total electricity output for Oklahoma comes from coal. Are either of you aware that 57% of our electricity output comes from coal in the state of Oklahoma?
There are a number of states where a significant portion comes from coal, and we expect that to continue.
In Oklahoma, we have a 20% lower cost of electricity than the national average. Are you aware of that?
Not specifically, but it doesn't surprise me.
So when these rules go into effect, you know what happens? Manufacturing jobs that have a high cost of energy, manufacturing jobs leave Oklahoma. And guess what? It's a lot more difficult to attract jobs to Oklahoma. Are you guys aware of that? So even though you suggest that this may grow the economy, right now that's not how it's working in my state of Oklahoma. I am out of time, but this is something you need to think about. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Mr. Posey from Florida.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Holdren and Ms. McCabe, for coming here today. I know sometimes it's really not fun here, and I hope it's not intended as a bunch of gotchas. I mean, I hope everybody's really trying to find common denominators and trying to make common sense meet science and get a good handle on this. And I think if there's enough debate, someday it will probably level out, and most people will share the same opinion. But there's just a lot of digging to get there. And you know, for the 100th time, you know, I believe in climate change. Never said I didn't believe in climate change. Some people have claimed that I said I did. I've never, I defy anybody to say I don't believe in climate change. I think the last time Dr. Holdren was here, we discussed climate change. I talked about the temperature of the Earth 65 million years ago, being significantly hotter than it is now, and some lame-brained blogger, you know, willfully and wantonly distorted that fact to say, I said it didn't bother the dinosaurs, why should it bother us? So there's a lot of venom flowing on both sides of this issue, which I'm afraid hinders more direct discussion of the facts, and that's real unfortunate. You know, I think from my perspective, you know, the overarching interest in the issue and the common ground that I think everybody has is it's important that we have clean air and clean water for everybody. I mean, every generation, everybody's healthier if we have clean air and clean water. And I think that's kind of where you're trying to go. And I think that's where the so-called other side is trying to go to. But there's just some things they want to quantify. And you know, science should be questioned. Everybody's opinions should be questioned. Mine should be questioned. Yours should be. Everybody should be questioned. And that's what we do here. Sadly, like I say, sometimes it gets a little bit more acrimonious than it needs to be. Sometimes the people that come in here and say politics shouldn't be involved in this are the most political people and politicize it the most. But that's unfortunate. But my interest, getting to the crux of it, is still trying to have some kind of quantification rather than just platitudes. They say, well, we do a bunch of little things and they add up to a big thing. Yeah, you know, I understand that, and I think everybody understands how that might work, but it's just still trying to quantify it. And, you know, somebody talks about a dime thin worth of coastal rise, but, you know, what I'm still kind of searching for is to quantify what man's contribution in the United States of America is to climate change. I mean, I know we're having it, you know, and everybody knows. I mean, you learned as a young child, the longer you stand in front of a fireplace, the warmer you get, generally speaking, unless there's extenuating circumstances. But I just, and you don't want to, you don't have to do it now. I'm not I'm not trying to do a gotcha, but that's really what I'm looking for, and if you can drop me a note on that, that's okay. I mean, it just doesn't have to be a big arena question. Just trying to quantify, if we take these steps, at the end of the day, what really difference is it going to make? And I'm not saying it's worth it or shouldn't be worth it, or whatever we do for clean air and clean water isn't important. I think everything that we do is. But just to kind of start working on the equation, it would be good to know, what we attribute to be natural heating of our planet, and do we expect that to continually increase, and then, to what extent mankind directly affects it, and then more particularly, to what extent the United States of America directly affects it. And I think that will put a lot of questions of a lot of other people in perspective too, if we ever get that point. And either one of you can respond, and not trying to be argumentative, but.
Well, Congressman Posey, first of all, I appreciate your opening comment about the need for continuing discussion and the hope for ultimate convergence. That is an appropriate sentiment. I would note, first of all, that in my long statement there is a lot of quantitative information, and there is reference to much more. And the facts, as we understand them, are that natural climate change, if it was the only thing now happening, the world would be in a long-term cooling trend. So the fact that is embraced by the vast majority of the scientific community who study these matters is that virtually all of the warming trend that we have seen in the last several decades has been caused by human activities, and most specifically by emissions from fossil fuel combustion, secondarily from deforestation and land use change. The second point I would make is, although you're absolutely right that climate has been changing for the whole history of the Earth for a whole variety of reasons, it is changing many times faster now than it changed before. And the problem that poses is that the ability of society to adapt and ecosystems to adapt is stressed and potentially ultimately swamped. 65 million years ago, when it was 13 or 14 degrees centigrade above the current temperature, the sea level was probably about 70 meters above the current sea level. We believe that the polar caps were free of ice at that time. All that ice was in the ocean, and that makes sea level 70 meters higher. Also, 65 million years ago, we didn't have 7+ billion people to feed, house, and try to make prosperous. So while you're absolutely right, the temperature has varied enormously over the millions of years, that should be no consolation in the current situation where we're driving the temperature up at an unprecedented pace.
Your time is up, and the chair will now be switching to Mr. Schweikert from Arizona. Let me just add, as I leave for my next assignment, that I personally thank the witnesses, and where we have some fundamental differences of disagreements, we certainly should keep our minds open and try to get to what really is the science. And let me say, in other areas we agree. And Mr. Holdren, I want to congratulate the White House on your recent decision to assign commercial contracts for space transportation and resupply of the space station to Boeing and SpaceX.
Let me just say that was NASA's decision, but thank you for your approval.
You might have had something to do with it. If you did, thanks. Okay. And with that, Mr. Schweikert. And Mr. Stockman will be taking Mr. Schweikert's position in line. Thank you.
Thank you. I have just some of the statements that were passed around today was the investments in Europe in climate change, and I think what was left out of the record was that Spain sold climate change bonds to its populace and guaranteed by the government, and the government now has rescinded that guarantee, and they lost a tremendous amount of money. And so for the argument to only point to Germany without pointing to Spain's failure, we would be remiss in the record to leave that out. Many Spaniards lost their entire savings investing in climate change technology. Also, too, I hear repeatedly, well, Obama's not going to close plants. I don't think anybody's suggesting that Obama's going to close plants. I think what we're suggesting is the policies will close plants. And that seems to bear out when the predictions are coming through across the country and what plants have to be closed. In reference to China, I was just there. The embassy said that their level of measuring of pollution was so high that their equipment could not measure it. And there's now a key factor in moving to Beijing that you are given compensation because you can't even breathe the air there, and many people working there, including some of the embassy staff, are not willing to work in Beijing. It's so bad. And I actually asked some of the Chinese officials if they thought they could meet their climate projections, and they laughed. They don't believe it, and I don't think we should either. And my colleague over here who said we're in the do-nothing caucus, may I remind the colleague by his own testimony that the EPA was created by a Republican, and he, by his own admission, says that the pollution has gotten 70% better. So I would argue that that's not do nothing, that's actually has done something. And I went to Maryland and asked repeatedly two things which I've never been able to get answers on. One was, I said, what ended the ice age? And the lead scientist at NASA said this. He said that what ended the ice age was global wobbling. That's what I was told. This is a lead scientist down in Maryland. You're welcome to go down there and ask him the same thing. So in my second question, which I thought was an intuitive question that should be followed up, is the wobbling of the Earth included in any of your modelings? And the answer was no. So how can you have wobbling of the Earth, cooling the Earth, and not be included in any projection? That's one for the books that I'm a little bit confused about. How can you take an element which you give to the credit for the collapse of global freezing and into global warming, but leave it out of your models? I'm a little bit puzzled because we still don't have any metrics, I understand, of how to determine global wobbling, which I didn't know was part of the reason for the end of the ice age. The last thing I asked him, which I can't get answers to, is how long will it take for the sea level to rise 2 feet? I mean, think about it. If your ice cube melts in your glass, it doesn't overflow. It's displacement. I mean, this is some of the things that they're talking about mathematically and scientifically don't make sense. But I'm wondering overall, when you have a model and you say we're going to leave out the most important impact of that model out of our theory and not talk about global wobbling, how can you make projections? So I'm concerned that while, again, you're saying Obama's not closing plants, you're correct on that note, which we here in Congress and other places take these words very seriously, but the policies will do exactly that. It will close plants, and it has in Texas, and it will around the country. And unfortunately, China, I know firsthand, is laughing at their own predictions. And with that, I'll let you respond. But if you have a model of global wobbling, please let me know, and let me know how long it takes the seas to rise 2 feet.
Congressman Stockman, I'm not going to talk about the economy of Spain. That's not my expertise, but I am going to talk about the science and help you a little bit with global wobbling to start with. Global wobbling, which refers to changes in the Earth's tilt and orbit, takes place on characteristic timescales of 22,000 years, 44,000 years, and 100,000 years. It is very slow. It brought us into ice ages. It brought us out of ice ages. When you take global wobbling into account, as I've already suggested, we would be in a cooling period now. But the warming inflicted by human activities has overwhelmed the effect of global wobbling.
But I was told wait a minute. None of the models have global wobbling in it. Is that true?
I'm about to explain why. The reason why is that global wobbling is a tiny effect on the time scale of 100 years in which we try to run these models to understand what's going on now and going on soon. It is so small. It is so small that you don't need to put it in.
No, you can't say it had a global impact and is small both.
It had a global impact over periods of tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of years.
We're talking hundreds of thousands of years to end. How long does the ice age take to end?
Ice ages went on for hundreds of thousands of years, in some cases for millions, and they ended over long periods of time as well as a general matter.
Doctor? And sorry, I don't mean to step on anyone. It just says the chaos of today, everyone's going to be running on to other hearings. Mr. Weber.
Thank you. Appreciate you all being here. Mr. Holdren, you just, in your exchange with Congressman Stockman, said that the economy of Spain is not your expertise. And I would probably venture to add that the economy of the United States is probably not your expertise either. Is that fair to say?
That is correct. In respect to the economy of the United States, I rely on folks like the Council of Economic Advisors.
The reason I
National
bring that
Economic
up
Council.
is because the last thing we want is an unintended consequence, which Congress seems to be good at, I might add, whereby the policies coming out of the administration, the EPA or any of the other agencies, have that unintended consequence of actually harming our economy. And so I try to be keenly in tune with that. I just want to make that point very, very quickly. In January of this year, a very cold January, I might add, you filmed a short video for the White House website entitled The Polar Vortex. In that video, you said, quote, "A growing body of evidence suggests that the kind of extreme cold being experienced by much of the United States as we speak is a pattern that we can expect to see with increasing frequency as global warming continues," end quote. And then many scientists on both sides of that issue quickly took issue with that. A complaint was filed with the agency seeking to correct it under the Federal Information Quality Act. Yet your office claimed this was an expression of your personal opinion. Is that accurate?
It is accurate, and as the President's Science Advisor, I express my personal opinion on the balance of science all the time.
Okay, and if that was nothing more than a personal opinion, were White House resources spent on producing that video?
I stated in the video that it was my judgment that we would see more of this. I believe that to be true.
But my question was about the money. Who paid for the video?
I assume that the White House Digital Services
You're
paid
contributing
for the
to the economy then, so maybe economy is part of your forte because some production company made out on that deal. Let me go to the regulation that you're proposing here, and I'm going to jump over to the ozone rule for just a minute. And EPA has a track record. I'm from Texas. Texas has about 1,200 people a day moving there. We've dropped our carbon emission 4% in the last almost 10 years, while we've gained 4 million people to a population of 25 million. So that's a pretty hefty sum, a little over 20%, I guess, or about not quite a fifth. So the ozone proposal that y'all put forward would cost $90 billion with a B dollars, lowering the ozone standard. And yet earlier you said to Jim Bridenstine that the assessment was irrelevant, that he was trying to make the connection on. So if $90 billion annually is going to cost a business, are you still prepared to say here today that it won't cost any more for electricity, that the cost of energy that's going to go up because of these kinds of regulations? Really, I realize we're not economy experts here, but do you really sit there and think that industry pays $90 billion a year more to affect just that one ozone rule and nothing's going to go up?
Well, Congressman, if your question is about the Clean Power Plan, the economic analysis does show that electricity bills will go down in 2030 because of the effects of energy efficiency. Well,
Listen, I applaud you for believing that. I've got some oceanfront property in Oklahoma I'd like to sell too. So I can't buy that. I mean, I'm own a business and I know how the economy works. Let me go to carbon for just a second. Texas, as I said, has done a great job. People moving there every day, about 1,000, 1,200 a year. And your carbon rule that you're proposing, with Texas cleaning up its air, and I believe that the EPA will admit that most of the ozone emissions, all right, the noxious gas emissions, come from non-stationary point sources, i.e. vehicles. Is that true?
Point sources is a term that refers to stationary sources.
Got that.
The emissions that contribute to ozone.
They're coming. Let me just short circuit you. They're coming from cars.
Not predominantly. Cars.
Non-stationary point sources. How would you describe that?
Cars make up about a third of the emissions.
Okay.
And utilities, power plants make up another third.
Those plants seem to be pretty stationary to me. But that's just me thinking.
Right, but they're a significant contributor to pollution.
I'm almost out of time. The point is that Texas has been really increasing I want clean air and clean water for my kids and grandkids, and for me, and for you. Texas has been improving their air and water quality without the EPA's oversight. We've got states that are doing a good job, and unfortunately, the rules that the EPA is proposing are going to put a lot of the country in non-attainment on ozone, going to cost a lot of jobs. So even though we're not economy experts, before we had that unintended consequence, we're going to have to really think long and hard about the data and the science used behind this. And I'm way out of time. I apologize, but I just want to make that point. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Sorry about that. We were working on some of our calendar. Mr. Bouchon, or excuse me, Mr. Kramer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. McCabe and Dr. Holdren, for being here. Good to see both of you again. I'm a little conflicted because I want to focus on the one hand on the reliability issues that Mr. Johnson brought up earlier, but I think I'm going to start with the flexibility issues, because both the agency and the administration have been quite adamant about the flexibility that the rule provides states. And I'm wondering how much flexibility was considered for states with regard to the rate of emissions themselves. I mean, did states have much flexibility in determining the emission rates?
Well, under the Clean Air Act, it's EPA's responsibility to determine the level of reductions to be achieved, or the ultimate performance level. But then equally under the Clean Air Act, the states have the responsibility but the opportunity to design a plan that achieves those goals using the best system that makes sense for them.
Okay, so going to another area of flexibility, and this was a question that was raised by a constituent of mine who's in the room, Perry Schaefer, who has a small business, a couple of small businesses in North Dakota called Environmental Services. He provides service and sells products to power plants largely. And how much analysis under the Regulatory Flexibility Act was put into this rule? And first of all, I guess, are you familiar with the Regulatory Flexibility Act and what it does?
I am.
Okay, so how much analysis was put into consideration of that act, and can you perhaps elaborate a bit on what the findings were and how it's applied in the proposed rule?
So the industrial sector that's addressed by the rule is the power plant sector, and those are primarily large businesses. So the economic analysis that we do looks at the impact that we expect from the types of choices that people will be making in order to comply with the rule, given what we see happening in the economy right now.
So when you're applying the analysis for the Regulatory Flexibility Act, you're considering the flexibility of the power plant, but not all of the small businesses that are affected by the rule as they impact the power plant. Is that what I just heard you say?
Well, we look at the approaches that we see being used by states and companies around the country, and the types of things that they are doing, and look at the expected impacts of those on costs and on the economy.
So besides the precedent-setting piece of this, which we haven't even begun to address, what the impact will be if this rule goes forward, if it's accepted and becomes the tradition and culture of the land, what impacts it's going to have on manufacturing and the rest of the industrial sector. Is it not true that the industrial sector depends tremendously on electricity, and that, in fact, whether it's small business, medium-sized business, or large business, there is a very direct, not just an indirect, but a very direct economic impact? And is the flexibility there to address small business?
Well, the analysis that we've done shows that the effect actually will be positive by reducing electric bills in 2030 as a result of the energy efficiency, and that the rule will lead to significant investment in the kinds of activities that support small businesses across our community in energy efficiency and renewable energy and other technologies.
Since you brought up this lowering of rates, or the lowering of the bills in 2030 due to efficiency, being a former regulator, economic regulator, utility regulator, I know full well that efficiency is not free. It's not even cheap. It may not even be the cheapest alternative, although I know that's commonly thought. But in a state where our retail rates today are average about between 8 and 9 cents a kilowatt hour, the cost of compliance with efficiency standards is oftentimes greater than the cost of the electricity itself. And the other thing I would raise is the plants have to be paid for, and they have to be paid for over the lifespan of the plant. And if you impose efficiency, which costs people, and frankly I think is a greater burden on the poor than it is on the people who can afford the efficiency methods, doesn't the cost of that plant, the stranded costs, still have to be covered one way or another, and whether it's at 8 cents or 9 cents or 10 cents or 30 cents a kilowatt hour? I mean, is that all factored in, or is this a very stagnant analysis, which I'm afraid it is?
Well, there's a lot in your question, Congressman.
Yes.
But on the question of stranded assets, one of the advantages to the long trajectory that the proposal has in it, which is compliance by 2030, was exactly to address those sorts of issues. We recognize that that's a reality, and we wanted to have a plan that would allow states to make choices that would avoid stranded assets.
And I think the other advantage is that when you go that far out, nobody's going to remember that we promised that rates were going to come down in 2030. My time has expired. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Kramer. Mr. Nagarbarro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. This is a question to both of you. The EPA, I think, calculates that this rule will cost between $7.3 and $8.8 billion. But the U.S. Chamber of Commerce recently published a study that said that they think it will cost the economy $50 billion per year through 2030. The question, we've heard a lot about how high energy costs can impact businesses, and that causes unemployment. But the thing that I think sometimes goes unsaid is, what does it do to American families? So does the administration acknowledge that if, for example, you increase the cost to a family for energy of $500 a year, that what that does to low income and senior citizens, and how they're going to be able to cope with that?
We recognize these are real impacts. That's why the rulemaking process requires the agencies to put forward an economic analysis so everybody can take a look at those things. I'll note that we need to be careful when we compare different studies to make sure that people are looking at the same things. So the analysis that we have that's in our proposed rule now is out for public comment, and people can give us our views on what the EPA is actually proposing, as opposed to perhaps other ideas that people might have.
But you're making some assumptions here, and you have a study, they have a study. There's a lot of numbers out there. Some of those numbers that I hear are even bigger numbers than that. But the real issue is you say by 2030 that this will be cost neutral because of energy efficiency. Well, number one, we don't know whether that efficiency will occur, but in the meantime, that senior citizen or that low income family is going to be paying more for their utilities.
If I may, Congressman, then I'll defer to you. Yes, certainly. One of the things that we did in developing this proposal was to look at the programs that are already out there, and many states are very far along with very good and aggressive energy efficiency programs in which they are finding that it is good for their local economies. The utilities and utility regulatory systems are very aware of the impacts on low-income ratepayers, and there are lots of programs that make sure that those impacts are mitigated or adjusted so that the benefits can be achieved without imposing those sorts of costs on people. And this rule, which puts states in the driver's seat for deciding how they're going to implement these plans, allows them all the flexibility to make sure that they're making those kinds of sensible decisions that are sensitive to the needs of their citizens.
I'd like to just add two very quick points. First of all, the Chamber of Commerce study was of what they thought the EPA plan was going to be. It was developed before the EPA plan came out, and the EPA came out with a different plan than the Chamber of Commerce analyzed. So no wonder the numbers are different. Secondly, the biggest factor in reducing coal use for electricity generation in this country has been the expansion of natural gas. And the reason that has happened, although natural gas does bring a greenhouse gas benefit, the reason it happened is that natural gas has been cheaper, not more expensive than coal. Yeah, well, again, I'm not sure exactly if the Chamber's study would be adjusted based on the new rule, but what I know that we've had a number of witnesses come and sit where you are, and nobody has said that they think that this rule will make the cost of electricity go down. I mean, and it's not just one or two people. We've had a number of people, and so I think the question that I have is that you basically created a tax, and this is tax going to be, for upper income people that this may not be an issue, but it is going to cost jobs. But more importantly, it's going to put a real strain on our families. Speaking of jobs, if you did an analysis and you talked about putting this rule into effect, how many jobs do you think would be decreased by the fact that you would put this in place? Do you think it's going to increase jobs or decrease jobs? What's your study?
Yeah, all of that is laid out in our regulatory impact analysis and looks at the impacts in various parts of the economy on job increases and decreases, and our information shows that there will be increases in some areas and decreases in other areas. There are already those sorts of shifts going on in the energy sector, and so our analysis reflects that. So I would commend folks to take a look at that and give us their thoughts on how we've looked at those numbers.
What was the net?
If you give me a minute, I will find that for you, Congressman.
Hey, Ms. McCabe, can I beg of you to look that up and
we can get it. We'll get it back to you.
All right.
We can get it back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Nagelbauer. Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. President Obama, in a nationally televised address, said his energy policies were, to quote him, necessarily skyrocket the cost of energy. And I think your proposed rule, and he's utilizing the EPA to do that. And I just want to make a public comment. I think this is blatantly unfair to poor people and senior citizens on limited income, and that's what you guys at the OSTP and the EPA have been doing, is driving up the cost of energy, and it is absolutely unfair to poor people and to senior citizens on limited income, as well as the middle class. Only the rich people can afford to pay for the energy that y'all's rules that you've already put in place and that you're proposing will go forwards. But why does the proposed rule that penalize states whose utilities have decided to invest in new nuclear generation by factoring those facilities into the state targets? Shouldn't those utilities that made the decision to invest in non-emitting baseload generation get full credit for their investments? Administrator?
Yes. So this is an issue that we're getting a lot of input on and a lot of good discussion. And as you acknowledge, there are states and utilities that have been more forward-looking in the types of investments that they've made. And we believe that the rule actually recognizes those advances.
Well, I don't think so. And the state should get full credit for those and the utilities that are doing so. Also, can you discuss the treatment of the nation's nuclear energy fleet in your analysis? You simply assume that states can keep all the nuclear power generation that they now have. How might the expected accelerated retirement of nuclear plants affect the cost of the rule?
Yeah, we recognize that states' choices about nuclear energy are important considerations for them. The rule itself focuses on the fossil generating fleet. That's our obligation under the Clean Air Act. We built into the rule some elements that we hope will provide some incentive to keep clean nuclear generation in operation to help the states with their carbon intensity, and we've been talking with states with significant nuclear resources to make sure that we fully understand what they see as the possible implications.
Well, Georgia's trying to put in the first 2 nuclear power plants that have been authorized in several decades.
That's right.
And it has run into problem after problem Georgia Power Company has and the Southern Company has because of this administration particularly. We need to make nuclear power easier to put in place. We need to have some policy through NRC as well as EPA and other entities that affect these to make it so that utilities can put in power plants and not so expensive, because that is going to make electricity much cheaper and it's non-emitting. Dr. Holdren, emails have emerged in the Richard Windsor lawsuit where EPA Administrator, former Administrator Lisa Jackson, violated the law by using false email identity that also revealed that you used a private email account for work-related emails. All this while you were at the White House. According to records from that lawsuit, you were sending such work-related emails to your duties at the White House even after you sent a memo admonishing other OSTP employees to stop using private email accounts. And in fact, you even pledged that you were going to cut ties with previous groups, and you utilized private emails, I understand, with the Woods Hole Oceanic Group, in spite of your pledge and against the law. Have you decided to heed your own advice and stop using your private email account when you're clearly discussing your work-related duties at the White House?
I'm not sure what that has to do with the topic of this hearing, but I will answer.
Well, you're here before me, and last time I saw you, we were in the office talking about another issue, and hopefully we can settle that in the future.
So the answer is I copied, as the regulations require in the White House, I copied all work-related emails that originated on my home computer to the White House so that there would be a record, so there would be no violation of the Federal Records Act. The reason I did some of those emails initially at home was that I didn't have the technological capability to get at my White House computer from home. We now have that capability, and I am no longer using my home computer when I'm not at the White House. But
so
again, I complied with regulations by copying those emails to my White House computer so that there would be no violation of the Federal Records Act.
And so all of your private emails were put into public records so that the...
As far as I know, all those related to work...
Freedom of Information Act, there's no violation.
As far as I know, there is no violation. As far as I know, I succeeded in my intention to copy all of my work-related emails to the White House computer.
Well, I certainly hope so. Lisa Jackson broke the law, and I think that you were doing the same thing when you did that. My time's expired. Thank you,
Mr. Holcomb. Thank you both for being here. We as policymakers certainly need to know how science is being used by the administration to justify new rules. Too many of my constituents are just struggling to keep the lights on, just as we were struggling earlier in this hearing, on home or work. So they really do need to know the effects the rules will actually have. To many of my constituents, many of this administration's new regulations seem to benefit lawyers in Washington, D.C. more than the environment back in McHenry County, Illinois. Administrator McCabe, we've had former administration witnesses testify to EPA's interagency collaboration as being merely a box-checking exercise rather than a true collaboration. This echoed back to your response to me in our previous hearing, where you would not say that EPA actually utilized DOE's technology readiness assessment for the technologies you needed to justify your own rules. This seems to be an ongoing problem throughout your agency and with environmental regulations in general. So I want to ask a more specific question about how EPA plans to react during the potential grid reliability emergencies that I'm afraid these rules might bring about. It is my understanding that there have been 2 instances where plants had shut down due to EPA regulations, but DOE required them under Section 202C of the Federal Power Act to resume operations in order to avoid a reliability emergency. If these plants did not resume operation, they would face unlimited liability from lawsuits under the Clean Air Act. One of the plants did resume operation and was slapped with National Ambient Air Quality Standard violation. The other was forced to settle significant lawsuits out of court. This should be a yes or a no. If you are receiving 2 conflicting orders from a regulatory agency, is it proper use of regulatory authority to just make a citizen choose which fines they pay and which mandates they ignore? This certainly seems to be a case where the EPA rules say that the lights being off is a greater benefit to society than people working. I wonder, could the administration's new plan be used in this way?
First let me say that EPA works closely with DOE and with FERC, and we have been for a number of years, to make sure that we are keeping on top of any potential reliability issues. Our system of laws in this country has provision for emergency situations that, as you note, have been activated not very often, and so we work within those system of laws. There are a number of things about the Clean Power Plan that we think will make those sorts of situations very unlikely to happen. One of them, for example, is the fact that the compliance period, the averaging times for utilities under these rules are lengthy, and so they will accommodate emergency situations of short duration because they'll be able to average their operations over a long period of time.
The point of my question was, really of forcing citizens and private entities to choose between which fine they will pay, which mandate they ignore. Again, I feel like this is an unfair situation to put them in. Let me address a second question to both of you. Factoring out supposedly co-benefits from other emissions, how do carbon reductions equate to reductions in heart attacks and asthma?
That all has to do with the effects of climate change itself. That is, carbon dioxide does not cause asthma by itself. It does not cause heart attacks. If, however, you change the climate so that there are more extreme instances of heat stress, you contribute to heart attacks. If you change the climate in a manner that increases pollens or increases conventional air pollutants of a number of kinds, then you affect asthma.
Administrator McCabe, is EPA considering any additional requirements for reductions in ozone?
We have a process underway now, as the Clean Air Act requires, to review the 2008 ozone standard.
And what is that lowering amount that is being considered?
EPA has not proposed a rule yet. We will propose one later this year. There's been a science and inquiry going on for the last couple of years, as is required by the Clean Air Act.
Was it an agency decision to create new rules, or was this the result of a lawsuit?
We're required under the Clean Air Act to review the National Ambient Air Quality Standards on a regular basis every 5 years.
Do you believe the EPA should have their hands tied on this if they know a rule cannot be complied with?
There's a premise in that sentence that I don't agree with. The EPA, ever since the beginning of the Clean Air Act, has successfully promulgated health standards for air quality that have led to tremendous improvements in public health across the country.
My time has expired. I yield back now.
Thank you, Mr. Holdren. Mr. Kennedy.
Thank you, Chairman. To Ms. McCabe, thank you both. First of all, it's great to see you again. Thank you both for coming to testify today. Thank you for your service to your country. Ms. McCabe, at a hearing on the Clean Power Plan back in July, Dr. Cash, who is the Commissioner of Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, highlighted the successes of RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in New England. For example, he indicated that through RGGI, the participating states have been able to reduce carbon emissions by 40% while simultaneously expanding the regional economy by 7%. It's my understanding that EPA recognizes the effectiveness of multi-state partnerships like RGGI and has explicitly drafted the proposed rule to allow partnerships like these to continue. I was hoping, Ms. McCabe, that you might be able to discuss some of the advantages of using a regional approach like this to reduce carbon emissions and its impact on innovation.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question, and Dr. Cash is very eloquent on the benefits of the program to Massachusetts. I've had that conversation with him. There are a number of benefits, and I'll just emphasize that in our proposal we are agnostic about whether states might want to join with other states, but there definitely are some advantages. One advantage is that as you make the pool of participants larger, you increase the opportunities, and that will generally lead to more opportunity for more cost-effective reductions. The bigger the pool, the more opportunity. So that's one. There are advantages that some states may perceive because of the way the energy production system works. That is, many companies operate in more than one state, and so it can reduce complexity for there to be a regional plan that states can work within. And and so that's another definite benefit. It can simplify. The RGGI system has some very straightforward compliance mechanisms in place that simplify the operation of the program, and again, that brings costs down, brings more certainty to the process.
Great, thank you. And now a question for you both. Dr. Holdren, maybe you can start. It's often been said, or at least reported in the press, some aspects of the press, that the administration is waging a quote-unquote war on coal. However, I think it's important to note that thus far the administration has invested about $6 billion in support of developing carbon capture and other technologies to try to make coal more efficient and to reduce its environmental impacts. I believe in December of last year, DOE issued a solicitation making up to $8 billion in loan guarantees available to fossil fuel projects. Dr. Holdren, I was wondering if you could just respond to the assertion about war on coal and discuss some of the administration's efforts.
Thank you, Congressman Kennedy. We have actually addressed that a number of times. I know you had to be out of the room, but
apologies.
The President and the administration are certainly not waging a war on coal. Far from it. As you point out, we're investing billions and billions of dollars in improving coal technologies with the understanding and the expectation that coal will continue for many decades to come to play a significant role in our electricity generating system. One of the things we noted was that under the proposed rules, coal would still be generating 30% of U.S. electricity in 2030. That's a lot of electricity. It's a lot of coal, but we hope to do it much more cleanly.
Ms. McCabe, anything to add?
No, I second it.
Okay. I apologize for making you repeat yourself, but I appreciate the fact that you did. Thanks very much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. And I'm going to recognize myself, and I'd actually like to hand a couple minutes over to the good doctor, Dr. Bushong.
Thank you. I had another committee markup. We just reauthorized Amtrak over in transportation, so my apologies for not being at the entire hearing, but I want a couple follow-ups. First of all, Ms. McCabe, I'd like to invite you to my district for a public hearing on the EPA on the new rule. In fact, any coal-producing state, if EPA could come and and listen to what the people in my district or other coal-producing states have to say, I'm inviting you to my district to do that. Dr. Holdren, I'm going to request from you that the White House and the EPA release all the scientific information, including all the data justifying the premise that is being promoted that this regulation, the new power plant regulations, will decrease the incidence of asthma and heart attacks, including all the medical background information. I've requested this before from Health and Human Services and others, and they've hidden behind HIPAA regulations, but I'd request that we get all that information to back up those claims. And also, as you admitted, there is a difference between particulate emission and CO2 emission, and this hearing is primarily about CO2 emission, and I'll give you that there is a significant difference, and the comments I made earlier are primarily based on particulate information, but also then you can't use that and say it's justifying CO2 emission requirements. My final comment will be carbon capture and sequestration is not economically feasible and not commercially available for my state. Therefore, putting in place regulation that requires it to comply is not also economically feasible for my state. I understand the science behind it. I agree that industry and all of us should always be looking for better ways to burn coal. But the time frame and the assumptions that are made for this rule are off base for my state. And 85% of our power is from coal. We're a huge manufacturing state. We're going to lose jobs. My district has every coal mine in the state. We're closing 2 power plants. We've closed 2 coal mines now. And I would implore you to look at that economic information. I yield back to the chairman.
Thank you, Doctor. And forgive also the comings and goings today. This is just a chaotic moment as we're trying to finish off this week, and so all the running back and forth. I had 2 minutes left on and I'll ask you to put that on the clock, so we're doing some splitting of time. It's a conversation I would love to do in much greater depth, and my point of reference is actually sort of the discussion of allocation of resources. So in some ways, it's less about ACO2, the PM10, some of the NOx, some of the others. It's the allocation of resources and where we maximize benefits. Sitting in those same chairs about 2 months ago, we had 4 researchers, all absolutely believed in the difficulties with ACO2 in the environment. But when asked the question of what you would do for the next 5-10 years, the allocation question was, and I was surprised at the response. It says, I would deal with invasive species. I would deal with fish populations and some others. So there was a real interesting allocation question. And I have great fear that much of sort of the discussion we're having around today may be driven by those who've invested in certain technologies, and as my father used to say, it's always about the money. Am I being, let me ask, at a high level, policy level, how much sort of moves into the discussion of, are we driving the allocation of resources where we maximize benefit to our society and the environment? And that's actually, I think, more of a Ms. McCabe type question.
Actually, I'm going to start, and then I'll
Well,
I'll
actually,
turn
I'd like
to
to
Ms.
flip.
McCabe.
Could I flip it?
Yeah.
Because
I'll
I'll
flip it very quickly. But allocation, of course, is always a big challenge. In the climate change domain, the problem is that if we focus constantly on shorter-term priorities and push off the climate change steps that we need to take, it's going to be impossible to meet the 2 C target or even the 3 C target.
There's actually a problem in that. If you and I go back to literature that I think even you were a participant in a decade ago, none of us expected the revolution that's happened in natural gas. Who would have ever thought we would have met and exceeded the Kyoto Accords because of the long-term futures prices of natural gas? So sometimes that arrogance of knowing what tomorrow is, we're wrong. And this is rude to do. I'd love to carry this conversation on in the future.
We should.
I'm now beyond my time, and I have to run to another committee. So thank you, and I'm going to actually hand over chairs so our ranking member can do her 5 minutes. Madam Ranking Member.
Thank you very much, and I have to apologize. I was one of those that had to go to another committee for a markup. But Dr. Holdren, as you're aware, the Administration's Council of Economic Advisors released a report in July which makes the economic case for addressing climate change. The main conclusion is that delaying action is costly. In fact, the report indicates that if the lack of action results in warming of 3 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels rather than 2 degrees Celsius, then the increased economic damages to the United States could be as high as $150 billion annually. Now, I'm a nurse, and we've talked all about how much it costs and how many jobs, but I'm not sure how much we've talked about how many lives that are affected if we don't clean this environment. In your testimony, you mentioned a growing consensus among economists and others that there is a compelling case for making substantial investments to address climate change. Can you please describe the current state of the economic literature, excuse me, comparing the cost of action and inaction on climate change?
Yes, thank you very much. I do expand on that at some length in my testimony. What's been happening in the economic literature over the past 2 decades is an increasing trend toward a strong consensus that we need to take action sooner rather than later, precisely because of the kinds of findings that you cited. And by the way, there are other findings out there that point to even more alarming possibilities if we allow the temperature, the global average surface temperature of the atmosphere to go to 3 degrees Celsius or more. The likelihood of tipping points leading to truly unmanageable change goes up as one moves into those domains, and nobody really has a handle on what the upper limit of damages might be. Just from the standpoint of investment in prudent insurance, it makes sense to take steps now to reduce the likelihood of getting anywhere near those temperature regimes, and economists as well as natural scientists have really largely come to agreement about that.
Thank you very much. Let me thank both of you for coming and simply say that while we might sit here with our heads in the dust or whatever, the damage goes on. and it is time for us to address the issue, and I appreciate you coming. I appreciate your steadfastness, and I certainly appreciate the work of EPA. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. I'm evidence that if you stay here long enough, they eventually give you the gavel. And I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here and for your testimony, and for all the members who are left, which is one, for your questions. The members of the committee may have additional questions for you, and we will ask you to respond to those questions in writing. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments and written questions from the members. The witnesses are excused, and the hearing is adjourned. Thank you.
Hey, Dawn.